The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart hum at a frequency that belongs to 2 a.m., a sound like electricity thinking out loud. Sarah Chen arrives through the employee entrance at 18:47 hours, muscle memory converting it without thought, 6:47 in the evening, though the sun has been gone for hours and Portland's August heat still clings to the asphalt. She wears long sleeves despite the temperature, navy blue scrubs that hang slightly loose, deliberate camouflage. Her hair is pulled so tight it stretches the skin at her temples, dark and disciplined as a military bun, though she's been civilian for 3 years now. The ID badge hangs at her ribs. Just a name. Just a night shift nurse. She doesn't look at anyone in the break room. That's the first rule of invisibility. Acknowledgement invites questions, and Sarah Chen has spent 36 months perfecting the art of existing without being seen. 2 other nurses sit with coffee that's been reheated 4 times, scrolling through their phones. They glance up when she enters. Don't. She pours water into a cup instead of coffee, a small choice that says I'm not staying long, I'm not one of you, I'm passing through your world like a ghost. The water tastes like chlorine and clinical efficiency. Her left hand steadies on the counter. Scars map her forearms beneath the sleeves, shrapnel stories written in raised white lines that tell anyone who cares to read them about IED fragmentation, about Kandahar dust mixing with blood, about 18 months embedded with operators who taught her that silence is a weapon. She touches the ring on a chain beneath her scrubs, beneath the scrub top, against her sternum where it beats with her heartbeat. Silver. Engraved with call signs. She doesn't speak anymore. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen existed. She doesn't exist now. This version, the one pouring tap water into a styrofoam cup, is something smaller, safer, invisible. The charge nurse glances up. Sarah, you're on Trauma Bay 2 and 3 tonight, plus 4-bed ICU rotation. One of the residents called out. Understood, Sarah says. 8 letters. 2 words. No elaboration. No volunteering. No drawing attention. She moves into the corridors of Sacred Heart as if the hospital corridors own her rather than the other way around. The hallway smells like antiseptic layered over something older, fear, maybe, or the residual weight of every person who's come through these doors believing they're walking in on their worst day. The tile is cool beneath her shoes. 12 years ago, she would have owned this walk. Would have moved like something apex, confident, the kind of woman who commands deference without asking for it. Now she makes herself smaller. Walks the line between the wall and the center, never quite using her full space. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. Trauma Bay 2 holds a 73-year-old man with a fractured tibia and acute anxiety response to painkillers. His monitors beep in irregular patterns, sinus rhythm with occasional PVCs, nothing critical. Sarah reads the chart without picking it up, just looks at it long enough for the data to reorganize itself in her mind. Blood pressure 158/94. Heart rate 107. O2 sat 94% on room air. Kidney function is already showing signs of stress. For line running dilute lactated ringers, which is correct, adequate, textbook. But the 4 angle is wrong. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But it's wrong. She doesn't correct it immediately. That's the second rule of invisibility, don't draw attention through competence. Instead, she adjusts the 4 stand so the line angles differently, smooths the tape along the patient's arm as if she's just checking for infiltration, a routine gesture. Her hands move on their own, the kind of muscle memory that lives deeper than conscious thought. These hands have held field dressings on hemorrhage wounds. These hands have run manual CPR for 11 hours in a tent while rounds came in like rain. These hands know anatomy the way sculptors know marble. The line runs better now. The flow rate will improve by approximately 4 milliliters per minute. The man's blood pressure readings should stabilize within 15 minutes. She knows this with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this same correction 372 times, though she's been a civilian nurse for exactly 1,094 days. Good catch, the resident says, a young woman named Dr. Patel, still soft around the edges, still believing the textbooks tell the whole truth. I thought the angle looked okay, but you're right. Sarah nods once. Doesn't smile. Doesn't claim the moment. Just routine. She moves into trauma bay 3 before Patel can ask why Sarah thought to check something that wasn't obviously wrong, because that's the kind of question that leads to other questions, and Sarah Chen has learned to avoid questions the way soldiers learn to avoid IEDs, with complete, unwavering attention to every detail. Trauma bay 3 is empty. Waiting. The beds at 2 a.m. are like loaded weapons, ready for the next crisis. Sarah checks the crash cart without being asked. Inventory check, 14-gauge angiocath needles in the top drawer. Defibrillator pads expired 3 weeks ago, not replaced. She makes a mental note, the kind of observation that might matter in 4 minutes or might matter in 4 hours. Time is relative in emergency medicine. Minutes feel like days. Days collapse into nothing. At 2:14 a.m., the intercom crackles. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. GSW victim, en route ETA for minutes. Prep for massive transfusion protocol. The station erupts. Controlled chaos that looks like entropy to people who've never been trained to see patterns in disaster. Sarah moves into the bay without hurrying. Hurrying is panic. Panic is amateur. She's pulling supplies before the senior resident finishes reading orders, setting up the level 1 rapid infuser, positioning the trauma stretcher at the correct angle for a chest-wound assessment. Her hands place each item in its exact location. Syringes. Pressure dressings. The portable ultrasound unit. The monitors come alive with their electronic breathing. And that's when Dr. Marcus Sterling arrives. He's been at Sacred Heart for 17 years. Board-certified trauma surgeon. Former military advisor, never served, just consulted on some advisory board in 2009 and has worn that credential like a medal ever since. He has the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged by anyone with actual authority. His white coat is monogrammed. His watch costs more than Sarah's car. He owns Portland real estate and a reputation that precedes him like a smell. He sees Sarah. Not really sees her. Observes her in the way a surgeon observes a surgical tool, functionally, dismissively, assuming competence without respect. She's already positioned the monitors. She's already drawn up the medications that will be needed. She's already calculated the trajectory of the wound based on entry angle and the victim's positioning in the car, which means the bullet probably traveled through the right pneumothorax space, through the pulmonary vessels, exiting somewhere near the scapula. That's the narrative a wound tells if you know how to read it. Nice setup, Ms. Chen, Sterling says, and the way he says her name, it sounds like something he's reading from a name tag rather than a person he's ever actually met. Try not to get in the way when the real work starts. The words land exactly where they're intended to land. But Sarah's face doesn't change. No flush. No flinch. She spent 3 years perfecting this expression, the neutral mask of someone who accepts hierarchy without question. Understood, doctor. The victim arrives 90 seconds later. Male, approximately 32 years old, GSW right anterior chest, bleeding controlled by field medics but oxygen saturation already dropping. The nurses transfer him from stretcher to bed with choreography that only works if everyone knows their position. Sarah steps back as Sterling moves in, as he should. He's the surgeon. The authority. The man with the board certification and the monogrammed coat. But her eyes stay on the wound. The entry site is 2 centimeters lateral to the right nipple. The bleeding suggests arterial involvement, probably the internal mammary. Sterling reaches for the trauma shears but Sarah has already moved them to his exact hand height without him asking. He doesn't acknowledge it. Surgeons don't acknowledge the hands that smooth their work. Oxygen saturation 82% and falling, one of the residents calls out. Panic is threading into her voice. Sarah watches Sterling's hands hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough for most people to notice. But Sarah has spent 18 months watching surgical teams operate under pressure, and she knows the difference between decisiveness and uncertainty. He's going for a chest tube. Standard protocol. Correct protocol. But the angle will be wrong. She doesn't speak. Rule 2 is still in effect. Don't draw attention. But she steps forward slightly, and her hand touches the positioning light above the bed, angling it down 2 degrees, which means Sterling's vision of the intercostal space improves, which means his needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line will be placed correctly instead of just close enough. He inserts the needle. The hiss of air escaping, that specific sound like pressure being released from something that's been holding its breath. The sound of a pneumothorax decompressing. The O2 sat monitor begins climbing. 74%. 81%. 91%. Stable. Sterling works for another 14 minutes, and Sarah provides exactly what he needs before he asks for it. The tools migrate into his hand. The lighting adjusts. The vital signs remain within the window of survival. By 2:38 a.m., the victim is stable enough for transport to surgery. The crisis has resolved. Good work, Sterling says to the room. Not to Sarah specifically. Then he leaves, his monogrammed coat trailing behind him like a cape, like authority itself made fabric. The resident named Patel stays behind. She's watching Sarah clear the trauma bay with mechanical precision, restocking supplies, resetting the space for the next crisis. How did you know he was going to code? Patel asks. I didn't know, Sarah says quietly. I just observed what would happen if we were ready when it did. That's really thoughtful. Sarah doesn't respond. She finishes the chart and moves back into the corridor, where the fluorescent lights hum their 2 a.m. frequency, and nobody asks her anything else for the rest of the shift, because nobody really sees her at all. But someone does. Dr. Sterling paused mid-insertion on the stabbing victim's chest, his scalpel hovering above the second intercostal space. The trauma bay hummed with ventilator rhythm and beeping monitors, 8 residents circled like students at a surgical theater. Sarah stood at the patient's left side, vitals steady in her peripheral vision, when she noticed it. The chest tube placement was wrong. 2 spaces too high. The lung tissue below would collapse into the mediastinum within minutes. She took one breath and spoke, her voice barely above the monitor's hum. Second space placement compromises lower lobe expansion. Doctor. The room froze. Conversation stopped. Even the ventilator seemed to pause mid-wheeze. Sterling's head turned slowly. His eyes found hers with the precision of a targeting laser. When he spoke, his voice carried the theatrical patience of a man about to dismantle someone in front of an audience. Nurse Chen believes her community college anatomy course supersedes my 20 years of thoracic surgery. Please enlighten us with your expertise. He gestured grandly to the assembled residents, whose necks flushed with embarrassment that wasn't theirs to carry. One resident actually looked at his shoes. Sarah took one measured breath. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. What came next was a single tear that escaped her left eye, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that made her physically release pressure the way a pressure valve does when internal stress exceeds tolerance. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as surgical steel, and said only, "You're right, doctor. I should remember my place." The words hung in the trauma bay like a suspended blade. Sterling should have felt victorious. Instead, something in her voice, a steadiness beneath the submission, a weight beneath the meekness, made his spine stiffen almost imperceptibly. It was the same feeling you get when you think you're alone in a room and suddenly realize you're not. He recovered quickly, leaning back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "See that you do, Nightingale." The nickname dripped with condescension, designed to diminish, to cut. But Sarah simply returned to monitoring the patient's O2 saturation, which was rising exactly as it should, and said nothing else. 2 days later, Sarah pushed through the break room door at 2 in the afternoon, her lunch bag in one hand. The conversation stopped mid-sentence like someone had hit mute. 3 nurses and a respiratory therapist grabbed their phones, their coffee cups, their excuses, and dispersed within 30 seconds. The room didn't slowly empty. It evacuated. They moved like prey animals sensing a predator's presence, except the predator in their minds was the man in the white coat, not the woman in the scrubs. Sarah sat anyway. She unwrapped her sandwich, turkey and mustard on wheat, the same lunch she'd eaten for 3 years, and ate it slowly, mechanically, each bite a small act of defiance. The fluorescent lights hummed their industrial song. The refrigerator cycled on with a mechanical groan. She was alone at the Formica table, and she knew it was deliberate. She also knew that leaving would be submission. So she stayed. That same week, Sterling posted a notice on the unit board in red marker where every staff member passed, Nurse Chen, overstepping scope, final warning. The letters were large enough to read from the medication cart. A nursing assistant whispered to another as they clocked in, Sterling's got it out for her, poor thing doesn't stand a chance. The words carried the tone of someone watching a smaller animal being circled by something larger. The worst moment came during a routine dressing change. Robert Callahan was 68 years old, a decorated Army Ranger whose throat had been destroyed by an IED blast in 2009. The explosion had stolen his voice but left everything else intact, his intelligence, his dignity, his awareness. He communicated through eye contact and careful hand gestures, a man who had lived 15 years in silence and somehow made peace with it. Sarah was gently cleaning the tracheal stoma, her movements precise and unhurried, when she murmured low reassurances, "You're doing great, Mr. Callahan. This should feel better by tomorrow." His eyes thanked her. That's all he had. The door to the patient room burst open. Sterling walked in with Callahan's adult daughter and son-in-law in tow, like a general arriving with his counsel. The daughter was smiling, genuinely grateful, carrying flowers. Sterling's face was arranged in an expression of deep concern, the look of a man about to expose something troubling. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he announced, his voice clinical and grave. "Nurse Chen has been engaging in inappropriate familiarity with your father, treating him like a child rather than maintaining professional boundaries." The daughter's smile faltered. "But she's been wonderful." "You don't see what happens when you're not here," Sterling cut her off smoothly. "This kind of behavior is precisely why we have protocols. It blurs lines. Creates confusion." He looked at Sarah with an expression that suggested she'd committed a minor crime. Professional distance is essential, especially with vulnerable patients who cannot advocate for themselves. Sarah's hands didn't shake as she continued the dressing change. Her movements didn't slow or hesitate. But another tear escaped, this one from the right eye, as if her body was keeping precise count of Sterling's wounds, and she wiped it without pausing. When she spoke, her voice was carefully modulated, almost apologetic. "I apologize if my compassion was unprofessional, Doctor." And that's when Robert Callahan did something that made the entire room stop breathing. His hand shot out and gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Not violently. Desperately. His eyes were pleading with an intensity that transcended his voicelessness. He was trying to tell them something with nothing but eye contact and grip strength, a man saying without words that they were wrong about this woman, that she had done something for him no nurse had done in 15 years. His daughter gasped softly. Sterling's smile tightened. Sarah gently released his grip, her fingers barely exerting pressure, and whispered, "It's okay, sir. It's okay." She finished the dressing change while Sterling watched with the satisfied expression of someone who has successfully planted doubt where none existed before. When he left the room, he was already calculating his next move. 3 weeks later, at 11:45 p.m. on a night shift that felt like every other night shift, a man in civilian clothes walked past the trauma bay. He was Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, recently rotated stateside. His name was Travis Morrison, and he was visiting his younger brother who was recovering from appendectomy surgery on the 3rd floor. Morrison was a combat medic, the kind of soldier who carried medical knowledge the way other men carry wallets, always accessible, always ready. He was walking past the trauma bay when a code alert sounded. Not emergency. Code blue. Cardiac arrest. Morrison glanced through the window out of pure habit, the way a pilot glances at the sky even on days off. Inside, a motorcycle accident victim was crashing, a 24-year-old male with a collapsed left lung and hemorrhage they couldn't control fast enough. Two residents were struggling with positioning, their hands not quite synchronized, their movements carrying the tremor of panic. The attending was shouting orders. The machinery was singing its emergency song. Then Morrison saw her. Sarah moved into the trauma bay like something shifted in her skeletal structure, like gravity had changed its mind about which way was down. Her hands found instruments before they were offered. Her voice dropped 3 octaves and took on a precision that made the residents look like they were moving in slow motion. She was performing a forehand vascular clamp technique, a field procedure, not a hospital procedure, a technique designed to save lives in forward operating bases where there was no time for the textbook approach. She was whispering assessments in a voice Morrison recognized from his own training: tension pneumo, left side, tracheal deviation confirmed. Needle decompression before he herniates. 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. Morrison pushed through the trauma bay doors. He stood frozen, watching her hands move with combat efficiency, watching her perform a procedure that didn't belong in a civilian hospital, watching someone who had no business knowing this operate like she'd done it 100 times before. Because she had. The patient's O2 saturation climbed, 72. 78, 84. Approaching safe. Morrison stared at her. That's a Kandahar Special Forces field cut. Where the hell did you learn that? Sarah's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide with something that looked like fear, or recognition, or both. The patient was stabilizing. The machines were singing better songs. She stripped off her gloves without responding, her jaw clenching visibly, and refused to meet Morrison's gaze. I studied emergency techniques. That's all. But Morrison was still circling her now, evaluating her the way you evaluate something that doesn't make sense. He'd trained with Special Forces medics at Fort Bragg. He knew what textbook training looked like. This wasn't textbook. This was muscle memory operating a human body like muscle memory operated a weapon, automatic, lethal, perfect. No, he said quietly. I've trained with SF medics. That's not in any civilian curriculum I know. Who were you embedded with? Sarah's voice dropped to barely audible. Please don't. She left the trauma bay, and Morrison stood there with his knowledge settling over him like snow. He found Sterling in the physician lounge an hour later, mentioned it casually while pouring coffee, the kind of offhand observation that seemed like nothing. You've got a nurse here with some seriously advanced trauma skills. Sarah Chen? She performed a Kandahar field procedure on a tension pneumo. Her technique was flawless. Sterling's interest sharpened like a blade catching light. What kind of skills? Morrison described the procedure in surgical detail. He described Sarah's voice dropping into that command register. He described hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this in actual combat. He described a forehand vascular clamp that shouldn't exist in a Portland hospital. Sterling's mind began calculating immediately. Unauthorized training. Possible credential fraud. Someone with secrets deep enough to bury herself in a night shift for 3 years. A weakness. An opportunity. Something he could weaponize. He finished his coffee slowly, methodically, and smiled. 3 days after Sterling's smile faded from the break room, a man walked into Sacred Heart's visitor lobby with flowers that had already started their slow surrender to gravity. Travis Morrison had come to see his younger brother, appendectomy, routine recovery, home by Friday, but the flowers were secondary. The real reason lived in the surgical wing, in the quiet movements of a night shift nurse he'd watched for 17 seconds during morning rounds, and something in those hands had made his spine recognize a language his conscious mind hadn't heard in 4 years. Travis was Navy. 13 years, 2 tours through Kandahar's valleys where the IED trees grew thick and the medevac birds came in hot. He'd done it all: combat medic certification, advanced trauma life support in places where textbooks became corpses if you missed a step. He'd seen the best field medicine the military could train into a human body. He'd also seen it only twice in his life, once from his lieutenant, once from a woman at Bagram whose hands moved like they'd been carved from muscle memory and mercy. That woman's face he'd forgotten. Her hands he never would. The hospital smelled like ammonia and resignation. Fluorescent lights buzzed their endless complaint against the ceiling while somewhere a monitor beeped its clockwork rhythm, beep, 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 the soundtrack of people caught between living and everything else. Travis had learned to move through hospitals like a ghost. Most visitors didn't. Most visitors walked loud and displaced air like they owned it. Travis had learned different. He'd learned to notice things. He'd learned that observation was survival. His brother Jackson was asleep in room 412, post-op day 3, morphine keeping him docile and pain-free. The bandage around his abdomen was white and institutional. Travis sat in the visitor chair and didn't touch anything because touching things in hospitals meant you wanted to matter, and mattering could get you killed. He learned that in Kandahar. He learned that everywhere. The code came at 2:53 a.m. Travis had gone back to the cafeteria for coffee, terrible coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been brewed in a shoe, and he was taking the stairwell up because he hated elevators, hated the enclosed space and the way they made his shoulders rigid. The emergency alarm cut through the silence like a blade. Code blue, ICU, code blue. A voice on the overhead, clipped and urgent, and every muscle in his body recognized that rhythm. That was the sound of someone dying and a clock that didn't negotiate. He was moving before he decided to move. Stairwell door kicked open. Third floor landing. Out into the ICU corridor where chaos had that specific shape it always took, controlled panic, people moving with purpose but not quite running because if you ran it looked bad, and hospitals were all about appearances. The room was 312. He could see it from the hallway, the door open wide, emergency lighting casting everything in the color of catastrophe. A man on the bed, grey hair, military bearing, even unconscious, that specific posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime standing at attention, and his chest wasn't moving right. The rise and fall was shallow, desperate, the breathing of a body trying to convince itself it still knew how to live. Dr. Sterling was there. Troy Sterling, attending surgeon, the kind of man whose jawline suggested breeding and portfolio management and the belief that competence was a birthright that didn't need proving. He had a tube in his hand, endotracheal, too wide, wrong gauge, and he was trying to force it where it didn't belong while a nurse stood to his left with terror written across her face in letters nobody could miss. "He's not responding," the nurse said. Voice shaking. "Doctor, the saturation is..." "I don't need color commentary," Sterling snapped. "Get me a smaller tube, now." But there was no smaller tube in the world that would save what Sarah Chen saw when she appeared in the doorway, the way a shadow appears when you stop paying attention to the light. She didn't move. She stood there like a woman paralyzed by mathematics, the terrible equation of revelation versus death, of anonymity versus a man who was currently drowning in his own throat because his tracheal scar tissue was collapsing like wet cardboard, and Sterling was using a protocol from 2003, and oxygen saturation at 64 meant the brain was already dying and she could see it, all of it, the entire scenario mapped out with the precision of experience that had no place in a civilian hospital. Robert Callahan. The mute veteran. The man Sterling had used as a weapon against her 3 weeks ago, screaming about inappropriate familiarity while Callahan's family watched like it was dinner theater at a medical conference. She'd accepted that humiliation with measured breath, with her composure intact, with the careful architecture of invisibility she'd spent 3 years constructing. She'd taken it because taking it meant surviving. Surviving meant nobody had to know what lived underneath the scrubs. And now he was dying because Sterling was incompetent and arrogant and still using techniques that had been replaced when she was learning her first combat medicine lesson in a desert that didn't forgive mistakes. Her hands moved. Not a decision. Not a thought. Something deeper, the voice of training, of muscle memory screaming louder than survival instinct. Her feet crossed the tile. Needle decompression kit materialized in her hands like they'd never been anywhere else. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the precise point where needle met flesh and the hiss of air escaping, that terrible beautiful sound of pressure releasing, of a body getting its breath back, of 90 seconds standing between life and being a statistic on a hospital census report. O2 saturation, she whispered. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremor. She spoke like she was ordering coffee, like this was the 743rd needle decompression she'd performed, like muscle memory had its own gravity and it was pulling her forward whether she wanted it to or not. Climbing. 72. 81. Sinus rhythm. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator breathing for Robert Callahan, doing the work his body had temporarily forgotten. Sterling's face moved through 3 expressions in sequence: relief that the patient was alive, recognition of what had just happened, and then something else, calculation moving across his features like a predator recognizing the shape of prey it thought was harmless. His eyes tracked to the recording system mounted in the corner of the room. The red light blinked steady. Everything she'd just done, every whispered assessment, every clinical observation that belonged in a Special Forces field hospital 3,000 miles away, captured in digital silence, stored where he could access it, weaponize it, destroy with it. Sarah stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Everything was perfect and everything was ruined, and she could feel the moment of transition like falling from an airplane, that weightless instant before the parachute realizes you're coming. Good work, Sterling said quietly. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that preceded demolition. Really impressive, actually. Get back to your charts. She left the room. She did not run. She did not allow her pulse to accelerate visibly. She walked down the corridor with the precise gait of someone who'd learned to hide fear under the architecture of discipline, and she could feel Sterling's eyes on her back like a thermal scope tracking movement. Somewhere behind her, he was already thinking. Already strategizing. Already reaching for his phone to make calls that would activate networks built over 40 years of golf games and hospital board meetings and strategic marriages that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. 23 minutes later, Sterling had requisitioned the recording system. 37 minutes, he'd sent emails to 3 board members flagging a credentialing concern. 44 minutes, he'd made a call to an investigator at the Oregon Board of Nursing, speaking with the kind of careful precision that suggested collaboration rather than accusation. The trap was snapping shut on Sarah's fingers and she couldn't pull free without severing something vital, and either way, pull or don't pull, she bled. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Travis Morrison had seen the entire code from the hallway. Had watched Sarah Chen perform a forehand vascular clamp technique with her peripheral vision and her whispered clinical assessment and the kind of fundamental medical competence that didn't come from accelerated nursing programs or online certifications. The worst part was that Travis understood what he'd witnessed with the clarity of someone who'd done field medicine alongside the people who wrote the field medicine manual. He found her at the charting station. 4 a.m. The graveyard shift moving through its slowest hours, the time when hospitals felt like museums for the dying. Sarah was entering vitals with the deliberate focus of someone trying to disappear into clinical notation. Travis pulled up a chair. Didn't ask permission. Military people didn't ask permission for necessary things. That's a Kandahar Special Forces field cut, he said quietly. The words landed like a grenade with the pin removed. Forehand clamp. 2-person procedure, usually. Where the hell did you learn that? Sarah's hands froze over the keyboard. 1 moment stretched into 2. Into 3. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless frequency, and somewhere down the corridor a patient called out for water, for morphine, for their mother, all the small voices of suffering that filled hospitals at night. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said. But her voice had changed. Dropped an octave. Lost the softness that had defined her performance for 3 years. 12 years in naval medicine, Travis continued. I've seen 3 people use that technique. 3 people in my entire life. One was Lieutenant Hawksworth in Sanjin Valley. One was a woman at Bagram whose name I never learned. And just now, I watched you bring a man back from the edge of clinical death using a procedure that isn't taught at Oregon Health Sciences University. He paused. Let the silence do its work. Senior Chief. That's the rank I'm reading in your hands right now. That's the rank I'm reading in every decision you made in that room. Sarah didn't answer. Didn't confirm. But she also didn't deny, and denial would have been so much easier. Denial would have been the safety play. Whatever happened with Sterling, Travis said, whatever his planning with that recording, you need to know that 3 years of night shift anonymity doesn't erase what you are. And I need to know what he knows. Because if he's hunting you, I need to know why. The code alarm sounded somewhere in the building. Distant. Someone else's emergency. Sarah's fingers returned to the keyboard and she typed Callahan's name and his vital signs and his prognosis, stable, transferred to surgical ward, expected full recovery, and she typed it all like Travis Morrison wasn't sitting beside her with 4 years of questions and recognition and the terrifying clarity that came from understanding what hiding actually cost. Go back to your brother, Sarah said quietly. Forget what you saw. I can't, Travis said. And he was right. Nobody forgets. Robert Callahan's chart sat on the desk outside pre-op like a ticking bomb nobody recognized. Routine tracheostomy revision. Scarring from blast injuries in Kandahar 3 years ago. Sarah wasn't assigned to his case, Sterling had made certain of that, but she was finishing notes at 6:24 a.m. when the intercom crackled overhead. Code Blue, Pre-Op Bay 3. All hands. Her hands moved before thought could stop them. The bay door swung open to chaos. Robert lay seizing on the surgical bed, body rigid, monitor screaming in pitch-black panic. His tracheal scar tissue had collapsed into tension pneumothorax, the airway closing like a fist. Sterling stood frozen at the bedside, a size 4.0 endotracheal tube trembling in his grip, trying protocols that belonged in a textbook written 20 years ago. The anesthesiologist was calling for a crash cart. The resident looked like she was going to vomit. Sarah was already moving. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She crossed the room in 4 strides, muscle memory carrying her past Sterling's shoulder, her eyes reading the patient's color, the oxygen saturation dropping past 68, the tracheal edema swelling like a fist closing around Robert's airway. 16-gauge needle. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands found the anatomical landmarks without hesitation, landmarks she'd learned on living soldiers in forward operating bases where there was no time for caution or protocol or hierarchy. She didn't feel the needle go in. She felt only the relief, the hiss of air escaping under pressure like a tire blowout, the pneumothorax decompressing, oxygen saturation climbing, 71, 79, 86, 91. Sinus rhythm, she whispered, and her voice carried the flat precision of someone who had said those words in conditions where failure meant watching people die. Breathing spontaneous. Core temp 34.8. Pain is data. Let him wake. Her hand stayed steady on the needle. Robert's seizure stopped. The monitor's screaming became a measured beep. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. The recording system in Pre-Op Bay 3 captured everything. Every word. Every clinical assessment whispered with the authority of someone who had done this in Kandahar firefights with mortars landing outside, with limited supplies, with no mercy from physics or blood loss or the knowledge that failure meant 50 wounded people would die in the dark. The voice on that recording didn't belong to a night shift nurse. The hands on that recording didn't belong to someone who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breathing like a ghost in the corner. Sarah released the needle with the careful precision of someone removing evidence. She didn't look at Sterling. She stepped back from the bed with the kind of measured composure that made the anesthesiologist's hands tremble. Robert Callahan's oxygen saturation held at 94. His blood pressure was climbing. The patient Sterling had been failing to save was now stable because a nurse whose name he didn't know had moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators trained in the worst theaters of human conflict. He needs a proper airway, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a register that wasn't quite a question. But he's stable enough now. Sterling opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She walked out of Pre-Op Bay 3 at 6:51 a.m., still wearing the same scrubs she'd worn for 12 hours, and the recording system kept its perfect digital silence. By 8:08 a.m., Sterling was on his phone to Gregory Hendricks, board member and former law partner, describing what he called irregularities in Nurse Chen's credentials and suspicious expertise in procedures outside her defined scope. By 9:15 a.m., Hendricks had convened an emergency credentialing committee meeting for that afternoon. Sterling was already calling the Oregon State Nursing Board, his voice carefully wounded, asking them to investigate whether a certain nurse had misrepresented her training qualifications. The wall started closing from every direction at once. He called Sarah's listed references, supervisors at 2 Portland area clinics from 5 years ago. His voice was apologetic, concerned. "We're conducting a routine credentialing review and found some concerning gaps. Did Ms. Chen ever mention military medical experience? Any training that wouldn't be standard for an RN?" The supervisors, confused and uncomfortable, said no. Sarah had been quiet, competent, unmemorable. She'd never mentioned anything unusual. That's when Sterling made the call that made him a federal problem, though neither of them knew it yet. He contacted a retired Navy personnel liaison at the Pentagon Civilian Human Resources Division, using a pretext about verifying employment dates. His voice was smooth, official. "We're processing a routine background update for hospital credentialing. Do you have any record of a Sarah Chen with Special Forces medical training? Anything outside standard Navy Medical Corps?" The liaison, a 30-year veteran named Colonel James Mercer who still took every inquiry seriously, said he'd look into it. He looked into it, and what he found made him sit still for a long time at his desk. Then he picked up a phone that still had direct Pentagon connections, and he started making calls of his own. But Sarah didn't know that yet. At 2:24 p.m., she was called into the conference room on the 3rd floor. Sterling was already there. So were 2 board members, the hospital attorney, and the administrator, her expression the particular exhaustion of someone about to do something they didn't want to do. The recording played on a laptop. Sarah's voice, precise and lethal. Her hands, moving like they'd done this 10,000 times before. Her clinical assessment, captured in digital crystal clarity. "Ms. Chen, we need you to explain where you received this training." The administrator's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Sarah sat perfectly still. Hands folded in her lap. She couldn't explain. The words lived behind a wall of PTSD and panic attacks and the specific trauma of carrying too much for too long in places where mercy wasn't a luxury. She couldn't unlock 3 years of careful amnesia without shattering the things she'd done to survive coming home. She couldn't speak about Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen without becoming that person again, the one who dreamed in Dari and woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. One measured breath. "I have nursing credentials in good standing. Everything else is private." Sterling leaned forward. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had already won. "Private doesn't work when you're performing unauthorized procedures on hospital patients. That recording shows." "It shows I saved a patient's life," Sarah said. Not angry. Not defensive. Just the simple fact, stated the way you describe weather. When his assigned physician couldn't. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the administrator spoke the words that ended something Sarah didn't know was still alive. Without explanation, "We have no choice but to recommend your immediate termination pending full investigation." It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in regret. Security escorted her out with a severance check for 2 weeks' pay and a non-disclosure agreement that forbade her from discussing her termination, her credentials, or the incident with anyone. The rain had started, Portland's endless autumn rain, hammering the parking lot like applause for something that hadn't happened yet. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes without turning the key, still wearing the scrubs that no longer mattered, watching other people walk past to their normal lives where competence was rewarded and invisibility was a choice instead of a survival mechanism. She drove home in a fog that had nothing to do with weather. Her son Marcus found her at the kitchen table at 4:44 p.m. She was still in scrubs. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that comes when a person has been moving so fast for so long that they finally stop and realize where they are. There were tears, the first ones in 3 years, pressing against her eyes like something that had been waiting in the dark. Mom. Marcus was 14, old enough to understand that something fundamental had broken. Why are you home early? She couldn't look at him. The words came out fractured, incomplete, the voice of someone apologizing for a crime they hadn't committed but couldn't explain anyway. Mom made a mistake, baby, I forgot to stay invisible. But invisibility, she would learn in the next 12 hours, was over. Within 48 hours, Dr. Sterling moved like a predator sensing weakness in the herd. He sat in his office on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart, door closed, and made the first call at 7:43 a.m. to Gregory Hendricks, the board chairman, a man whose country club membership cost more than most nurses earned in a year. Sterling's voice was measured, calculated, the sound of a surgeon who'd spent 30 years weaponizing institutional authority. Gregory, we have a serious credentialing problem. One of our night shift nurses, Sarah Chen, has been performing procedures well outside her scope. I documented suspicious expertise in battlefield trauma. I'm concerned about credential fraud. He paused, letting that word settle like poison in water. Fraud. The thing that hospitals feared most. I'm requesting an immediate audit. The state needs to investigate. Hendricks asked 3 questions. Sterling answered 2 of them. The third one, are you certain? Sterling simply said, I wouldn't call otherwise, and hung up before doubt could take root. By noon, Sterling had the code room recording requisitioned and forwarded it to the State Board of Nursing with a cover letter suggesting the footage showed Sarah performing classified military procedures without appropriate licensure or authorization. He knew exactly what he was doing. He'd watched her hands move during that code with a precision that belonged in a Special Forces field hospital, not a Portland emergency room. He'd heard that combat medic whisper the words that terrified him, Kandahar Special Forces. Now he was going to bury those words under mountains of bureaucratic suspicion before they could surface. The recording would show competence. He would frame that competence as deception. The third call came at 2:15 p.m. Sterling reached former contacts from his Navy days, men who owed him favors from his medical corps rotations, connections carefully maintained through annual dinners and strategic golf outings. I'm trying to verify credentials on a former service member, he said to each one, his voice the picture of professional concern. Sarah Chen. Navy background, apparently. I need to know if she had any unauthorized training that she's now misrepresenting in a civilian hospital setting. The questions were careful. The insinuations were surgical. He didn't say she was lying. He just said the word unauthorized. He let the word do the work. By 4:13 p.m. that same afternoon, Sarah was called to an emergency meeting in the hospital administrator's office. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw the configuration of chairs, not collaborative, not conversational. Accusatory. Administrator Patricia Walsh sat behind her desk with the State Board's investigator, a thin man with reading glasses and a folder that looked 2 inches thick. Sterling sat to her left, his expression arranged in concerned professionalism, the face of a colleague simply trying to protect the institution. Ms. Chen, Walsh began, not looking up from her notes, we've received credentialing concerns. Questions about your military background, your medical training, the scope of procedures you've performed here. She finally looked up. We need you to explain the documentation we've found. Your service record. Your training history. Sarah sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her breathing was steady, the kind of steady that only came from years of practicing composure in rooms where composure meant survival. She looked at Sterling for exactly 1 second. Just one. Long enough for him to see that she understood what he'd done. Then she turned back to Walsh. I respectfully decline to explain, Sarah said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that fills emergency rooms before someone stops breathing. Walsh's pen stopped mid-note. The investigator's glasses slipped down his nose. I'm sorry, Walsh said. I decline, Sarah repeated, her voice steady as a heartbeat monitor in sinus rhythm. I'm exercising my right to legal counsel before answering questions about my personal background. What Sarah couldn't say was that explaining meant speaking the words out loud. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Kandahar. 18 months embedded with operators. The field hospital she'd run alone while bullets punched through tent fabric. The blood she'd washed off her hands that hadn't been water, it had been adrenaline mixed with survival. She couldn't explain because explanation meant unlocking the vault where she'd sealed 3 years of careful forgetting, and once that door opened, the PTSD would come pouring out like shrapnel, not in this room, not in front of Sterling, not when he was counting on her breaking first. Walsh exchanged a look with the investigator. The meeting ended within minutes. By 5:15 p.m., 2 security officers walked Sarah to her car in the parking lot. One of them carried her personal items in a box, the framed photo of Marcus, her stethoscope, the small brass compass she kept in her locker. The rain had started, a cold Portland drizzle that smelled like wet concrete and diesel exhaust. She carried the severance letter and the non-disclosure agreement in a manila envelope. 2 weeks' pay. 14 years of shifts, and 2 weeks severance. She drove home on autopilot. Her hands on the wheel. Her eyes on the rain-slicked road. The scrub still damp with the sweat of the morning code. The code she'd saved. The code she'd rescued from Sterling's incompetence. Marcus found her at the kitchen table at 4:06 p.m., still wearing those scrubs. Her head was down. Her hands were covering her face, and her shoulders moved with the kind of quiet sobs that only came when you'd been holding everything together so hard for so long that holding on had become the only thing you knew how to do. The box of her possessions sat unopened on the counter. Mom. Marcus pushed through the doorway, his backpack sliding off his shoulder. He was 14 years old, tall enough that Sarah had to look up now, old enough that he understood something fundamental had shifted. Why are you home? You said you were working until 7. Sarah looked at her son. She looked at his face, the face that still held hope in it, the face that didn't yet know how to construct walls the way she had. She wiped her eyes without hiding them, without making excuses. Mom made a mistake, baby, she whispered. I forgot to stay invisible. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway. He looked at the box on the counter. He looked at the severance letter partially visible on the table. He looked at his mother, who had raised him alone, who had worked night shifts for 14 years, who had never once complained about the exhaustion or the fear or the weight of carrying both of them into each new morning. And something in him changed. Not broke. Changed. He didn't ask more questions. Not yet. Instead, he set his backpack down slowly and walked to the table where his mother sat today. He pulled the chair next to hers and sat, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Rain hammered the kitchen window like something trying to get in. The kitchen smelled like old coffee and the faint metallic scent of hospital antiseptic that clung to her scrubs. Tell me, Marcus said finally, his voice steady in a way that reminded Sarah of who she'd been before she became invisible. But that conversation, that reckoning, that moment when a 14-year-old boy decided that his mother's invisibility had gone on long enough, that would come later. Because in that moment, sitting at the kitchen table with rain drumming against the windows, Sarah Chen didn't know that her son had already made a decision. A choice that would end everything Sterling had built. A choice that would take Sarah from the darkness she'd chosen and drag her into the light whether she was ready or not. She didn't know that Marcus was about to go to war with the entire institution that had just destroyed his mother's carefully constructed refuge. She didn't know that in less than 18 hours, her son would walk into the lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital carrying a showbox containing the medals she'd tried so hard to hide, the proof of who she really was, the evidence that would begin the unraveling of everything Dr. Sterling had orchestrated. All she knew, in that moment, was that she had failed at invisibility. That the wall she'd built for 3 years had cracked. That her son was looking at her with eyes that carried a question she couldn't answer yet, not because she didn't know the answer, but because once she spoke it, once she said the words out loud in this kitchen, she would never be able to unsay them. The rain continued to fall. The kitchen clock ticked forward. And somewhere in that space between who Sarah had been and who she was about to become, something irreversible began. Subscribe to see what happens next. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength. And comment, what would you have done in Marcus's position?